April 18, 1945. The Ruhr Pocket, Germany. On that cold, grey Wednesday, the Americans tightened their ring around Army Group B, and the fields, slag, heaps, and factory towns between the Rhine and the Sauerland, filled with columns of unarmed men marching under white rags, their helmets dangling from their belts, their eyes lifted toward an American sky they had learned to fear. And the story of why so many German soldiers chose to surrender rather than face American firepower begins there. In the final grinding phase of the Western Front, when the thunder of U.S. artillery, the shriek of fighter bombers, and the crisp tempo of radio-coordinated combined arms promised not a soldier's duel but an annihilation. The Ruhr was the industrial heart of Germany, and its last stand should have been bitter. Instead, hundreds of thousands walked out of the ruins because, by April, the Americans had perfected a way of fighting that made resistance feel pointless, a system where logistics, radios, guns, tanks, engineers, and aircraft fell upon a target like stacked layers of inevitability, where a platoon's call could summon a battalion of howitzers, where a bridge seized at Remagen drew a continent's worth of ammunition across the Rhine, and where a man in a foxhole heard more steel in 5 minutes than he had in some entire campaigns. The numbers were already telling the story. In Normandy, before the hedgerows fell and the breakout at Saint-Lay opened France like a map, American corps had overrun Cherbourg and flooded the prisoner cages with tens of thousands of German troops, who had discovered that under the relentless squall of naval guns and 105mm howitzers, strongpoints had a way of becoming sheepfolds. Then, through the bocage, Americans learned to crack the hedge with dozer blades, to lead with flamethrowers, to lash each field with mortar, and then top the assault with P-47s from the 9th Air Force, the stub-winged jabos that hissed in low and loosed rockets and bombs. By August, the Falaise pocket closed, and the road from Tron to Chambouy was a smear of metal and bodies, and the lesson was seared into every surviving German battalion. When the Americans made the circle tight and called down their guns, staying meant dying, walking meant living. The American secret was not a single wonder weapon, but a doctrine and a machine for applying it. At the fighting edge, U.S. infantry moved with radios the -300 Seychelles rupees slung across a back. The hand-sized -536 Seychelles rupees clenched like a brick which changed everything about tempo. A junior officer could reach his artillery, and the artillery could reach almost anything. In every division, fire direction centers fused map coordinates, forward observer grids, and meteorological data into time and target missions that landed shells nearly simultaneously. First, a distant crossing bark from the 105s and 155s. Then, at the receiving end, a single terror-filled instant when the air turned to metal. In the Ardennes, when the snow was still marked by boot prints and wrecked half-tracks, the U.S. Army had finally been allowed to use the proximity fuse for land warfare. By the spring of 1945, airbursts were cracking over German foxholes as a matter of routine, showering splinters down into trenches that would once have been safe. If a German machine gun nest kept its head up, 2 minutes later, a curtain of VT-fused shrapnel would be walking across it, and if it ducked, tanks would nose up to spitting distance with canister and high explosive. And if that still did not suffice, engineers would rake the embrasures with bazookas and demolitions. The Germans understood the physics of this as well as the Americans did. Fire superiority at the point of contact is courage's cruel accountant, and the U.S. Army paid on time and in full measure. Above the ground fight, American tactical air folded in like a second artillery. Under Quesada's 19 Tactical Air Command and Wayland's XX TAC, fighter bombers were put on a leash short enough to feel the infantry's tug. Air-ground teams shared radio nets, and in the last campaigns not a day passed without rockets streaking down the length of a German road march, or digging blossoms of fire out of ammo dumps. The P-47's 50 caliber guns were more than strafing tools. In a psychological sense, they were heralds, and the whispered name Jabbo had become a ward against daylight. The result was a tyranny of mobility. Any German force that dared to move in daylight drew American steel. Fixed positions simply drew more of it. When the bridge at Remagen fell into US hands on March 7th, the German command knew the Rhine barrier had failed. The Americans knew something else, that the river, once crossed, could be fed. It is hard to describe the quiet violence of logistics, but German infantry could feel it in their stomachs and in the lightness of their packs. The Red Ball Express had proven the American knack for improvising supply flows after the Normandy breakout. By the spring of 1945, the ports were open, railheads were running, gasoline flowed, and the ammunition parks bulged. For the man in the line that meant this, the barrage never seemed to run out. A call for counter-battery was answered in minutes, not hours. A preparatory fire that started at dawn might be renewed at noon, and then again at dusk. The Germans, running short of fuel, and with horses back in harness, dragging 105s they could scarcely fire, found their batteries hunted, and their movements choreographed by an enemy who always seemed to have one more belt of shells, one more company of Shermans, one more bulldozer to push a bypass. The American combined arms teamed the triangle of infantry, armor, and artillery stitched together by radios and engineers, was less elegant than the German ideal of mission-type tactics. But by 1945, it was brutally effective. A battalion probe ran into a belt of mines. Engineers went forward, tanks covered, mortars screened with smoke, and the heavy guns clapped on call. A village locked by two pack fronts. A company made contact. The Foss plotted the coordinates. A tot mission cracked every window and blew tiles like leaves, and then the tanks went in with infantry behind them. House by house, while a flight of fighter bombers circled for depth targets. German doctrine had taught that a single well-sighted anti-tank gun could paralyze a column. American practice answered that paralyzing a single gun was only a radio call away. It is one thing to be outmatched. It is another to know that your individual courage has no multiplier in a fight like that. That knowledge, repeated over and over between Normandy and the Ruhr, was the acid that ate at German will. And the Americans were not simply terrors in the moment of contact. They were reliable jailers. Thousands of safe conduct leaflets pass Jürchenfell from American planes and were handed forward in the lines, promising fair treatment under the Geneva Convention if men chose to lay down arms. Rumors that the Western Allies gave water, food, and a chance to write home moved as surely as any order. Opposite that was a dark certainty. The eastward road led to the Red Army, and across Poland and the Oder, where artillery and retribution came in the same column. In the west, the Americans were relentless, but they were not a spectre. Men judged their odds and chose accordingly. Even on the Western Front, however, the decision to surrender came through specific gates, and it is worth walking through a few of them to hear how they sounded. At Cherbourg, in late June 1944, American divisions under the 7th Corps had marched the Cotentin Peninsula flat. German coastal guns fired until naval shells and field artillery ground them down. The garrison commander, with no fresh water and the town rubble choked, gave up tens of thousands. No one who passed through those cages failed to write a letter home. That word moved through the Wehrmacht. There was a way to live, and the badge of it was to lift two hands before a man in a netted helmet. During the Falaise battle, a different kind of lesson struck. American, British, Canadian, and Polish forces closed the bag, and the sky fell on columns of fleeing Germans. The wreckage between St. Lambert and Chambord testified to a method, the welding of artillery, and air so thorough that men who slipped out of that slaughter felt like survivors of a natural disaster. By autumn, the Americans learned dark lessons in the Remagen, where trees shredded shells into wood and iron. But by the time Aachen fell in October 1944, the U.S. Army had demonstrated how it would take German cities' patience, mapping, and method, with block-by-block dismemberment under the umbrella of superior guns. When the bulge burst in December, German formations regained their dash, but ran into a U.S. artillery system that could move batteries like chess pieces and throw proximity-fused airbursts over their heads. In January 1945, many of those who had thrust toward Bastogne limped back and found themselves under exactly the same guns they had feared in Normandy. All that remained was to carry that method across the Rhine. The collapse inside the Ruhr molded the many strands of surrender into one rope. The Americans had seized a bridge at Remagen. The Germans had sworn would never fall intact. They had then thrown a bridgehead across and multiplied it with pontins and bailey trusses. Ninth Army from the north and First Army from the south pinched the Ruhr closed. Inside, with model unable to conjure fuel or ammunition, divisions starved of artillery support sat still and listened to a ceaseless rumble that meant the Americans had what mattered. When they fired, counter-battery fire snapped back like an elastic band. When they moved, fighter bombers pounced, twitching toward every glint of sunlight on steel. At village, after village names so ordinary they read like a directory, Wuppertal, Essen's outskirts, Hagen, Iserlohn, Dortmund's satellites company commanders judged their men's lives against the certainty of American guns and waved white flags from cellars still quivering with dust. These surrender waves were not acts of cowardice. They were rational acts in the face of an adversary who had eliminated the tactical bargains that gave courage a fighting chance. Consider how the Americans fought a crossroads. First, reconnaissance and infantry felt for the edges, drawing fire, calling grids. In minutes, a battalion's guns dozens of tubes would be laid, each corrected by observers who had trained for months in getting the first bracketing rounds fast. Add mortar at company and battalion, each with smoke and he. Then, if the Germans had sighted guns in depth, higher headquarters fed in corps artillery, 155s and 8-inch howitzers thumped in, and within a quarter hour the crossroads was being raked by airbursts detonated, at the right height without range-finding shells, thanks to the proximity fuse. On top of that came tanks, not as lone duelists, but in platoons covered by infantry and with attached engineers sweeping for mines. If resistance stiffened, a troop of tank destroyers with 76 or 90mm guns unlimbered, and if a battery or a truck park was spotted a mile beyond, aircraft were a radio call away. The German officer at that crossroads felt a telescoping of time, the sense that every American escalation ladder could be climbed in minutes. He also knew that his own response came with a delay paid in blood and short magazines. You cannot ask men to hold crossroads indefinitely under that clock. When you scale this pattern up to an army group, you get April 1945. By then, American communications nets were thick. Traffic control kept columns moving, and if a bridge blew, a Bailey bridge went up behind a smokescreen. If a German counterattack materialized at night, prefab illumination flares and star shells went up as if the moon had been switched on. Every German recollection of those days speaks in the language of saturation, of sky, of noise, of weight. The field kitchens worked in American lines. Rations were hot. Mail came, and then a barrage started again. On the German side, everything narrowed. Biscuits, exhausted horses, guns that could not be replaced, fuel that could not be found, and a gnawing certainty that the men behind them knew how to stitch their position into a coordinate mesh for someone else's guns. When the Americans demanded surrender inside the Ruhr, they did so with a credibility engraved by months of proof. There are other reasons that matter, because wars are human. The American Army had begun 1944 with a mix of green troops and veterans, and it paid for its learning. By 1945, platoon sergeants could pass the rhythm of an artillery prep by ear. Company commanders could read the map like a grocery list. Division and corps staffs had rehearsed river crossings until they felt like paperwork. On the German side, the veterans had been sifted thin. Grenadiers had their share of tough men, but the cadres were threadbare. Against American firepower, a green man's courage drains faster, and by April, even veterans measured the end and saved their men if they could. Surrender in that climate was not only fear. It was professionalism doing the last thing it could do for survival. And then there was the knowledge, pushed by leaflets and by word of mouth, that the Americans processed prisoners in volume. In 1944 and 1945, German soldiers watched whole companies and then battalions walk west with their hands in the air, past tank destroyers whose crews never even unbuttoned their turrets. Camps sprouted behind the lines. Wire went up, men were deloused, their names were taken. It created a strange, practical confidence. Lay down your rifle, step into the column, and your odds improved by orders of magnitude. When whole regiments did the same in the Ruhr, it was because officers understood the day's arithmetic and were allowed, in that final period, to act upon it. The American firepower that compelled those decisions was not purely kinetic. Deception and noise helped. The Ghost Army, the 23rd Headquarters Special Troops, used inflatable tanks and fake radio nets to make U.S. spearheads seem broader and heavier. Sometimes, a German battalion probing at night bumped into what sounded like an entire armored division. But even without illusions, American depth was everywhere. A German night patrol might discover that the light mortar it had marked in the afternoon now had a line of ammo cans behind it and a jeep idling nearby, its driver warming his hands. The moral of such tiny observations collected in a man's head: the Americans are inexhaustible. Surrender is, finally, a wager on time. In April, in the Ruhr, that wager paid out in the simple currency of breath. Old Model, who had spent a career pressing others to fight to the last round, watched his army group disintegrate into clusters of white flags and, unwilling to put his signature on capitulation, walked into the woods and ended his life. His men kept walking out, past ditches raked by proximity-fused bursts, past roads cratered by fighter bombers, toward makeshift cages that smelled of dust and coffee. The figure more than 500,000 Germans yielding to the Americans rather than die under their fire should not be understood as an accident of April. It was the sum of choices made across a year of battles in which American combined arms took shape as an instrument that collapsed the space between contact and destruction. In Normandy, those choices were isolated. In the Ardennes, they came with a thaw of belief. At the Rhine, they became an avalanche. If you ask a man who fought, then why he surrendered, he will give you a dozen reasons: a wife's letter, an empty cartridge belt, the way the ground jumped when the shells walked toward him, the knowledge that the soldier opposite had a radio and he did not, the tilt of the sky when a P-47 rolled into a dive, a friend lost outside a village no one will remember. But beneath those reasons was a truth his officers understood, even if they dared not speak it. The Americans had built a war-making machine that closed every escape hatch but one. At 1100 hours, the artillery answered. At 1300, the tanks found a side street. At 1500, the fighter bombers came back. And by evening, the choice had narrowed to a white cloth or a white cross. In the Ruhr, on April 18, 1945, that calculus reached its cleanest expression. The pocket's geography mattered, the river's hemming movement, the factory towns that offered cover but also trapped men and vehicles. But geography alone does not make 500,000 soldiers lower their weapons. The men inside the pocket had learned that firepower used with speed becomes not just an event but a system. And systems defeat courage by making it irrelevant. The United States Army fought in 1945 like a conductor with a baton whose orchestra was made of steel. Forward observers, aligned maps, efficient guns, disciplined logistics, tactical aircraft tied to ground nets, tanks that didn't duel so much as bludgeon at a tempo set by their own artillery, and engineers walking forward with Bangalore torpedoes while radios murmured on their backs. An American policy finished the logic by promising credibly that anyone who stepped out of that storm would be fed, held, and, in time, returned alive. That is why men who had fought for years under other skies, who had surrendered to no one at Kursk or Kharkov or Kasserine, walked out to the edges of their towns and waited for the Americans in April 1945, because they had seen what happened to those who lingered. That is why the long columns filed along the berms to the penned fields, why rifles were stacked like kindling outside farmhouses, why the cages filled too fast for the clerks to keep up. And that is why the Ruhr, that day, speaks for the rest of the Western Front's ending. A vast, subdued exhale from an army that understood the mathematics of American fire and chose life. They did not all surrender at once. The tide ran in ripples, and each ripple had its own name and map, square and hour. But the pattern was constant enough that a historian could lay tracing paper over the campaign and watch the same decision form again and again. Stay in place and be crushed by artillery that seemed to arrive by appointment, or step out with empty hands toward men who possessed more bullets than anger. In February 1945, during the clearing of the Ruhr Pocket, German units already felt that calculus hardened. First French army pressed from the south, while American the 15th Corps knifed in from the northwest. And every day, the winter sky coughed up P-47s that followed columns like hawks. The lesson traveled north and west, with returning stragglers. The Allies had reached a tempo where the first proof of contact was an orchestra of guns, and the second was the thin, high scream of a fighter bomber in a dive. At Remagen, when Americans seized the Ludendorff Bridge on March 7th and held it for 10 days before the battered truss collapsed into the Rhine, the psychological effect reached far beyond the riverbank. It was not only that a barrier had been breached, it was that the breach could be fed faster than it could be mended. Ponton bridges followed, ferries churned, Bailey spans rose under the drag of smoke pots, and German units on either bank learned that distance had ceased to be their ally because American logistics was a moving bridge in itself. Encirclement, once a maneuver, became a policy. Trap, talk, take. The Ruhr's closure on April 1st sealed in Army Group B, and with it the memory of 1,000 small defeats that made the larger one feel inevitable. When a German battalion commander looked out from a second-story window and saw American engineers walking with mine detectors while tanks idled like patient oxen and artillery, observers murmured into handsets. He knew what would happen to his defensive diagram. Take a farmhouse, once a node of strength, now a registered target. The Americans would paw at its edges with patrols until a map grid was firm. The first rounds would bracket the ridgeline. Smoke would climb to cut lanes of fire. Then, with a motion as practiced as tying a boot, the guns would adjust to airburst and pick apart every roof beam. The defenders would drop into the cellar, where dust suffocated and ears rang. Tanks would nose up to zero the embrasures. A bazooka man would slap a rocket at the corner and send brick dust into everyone's teeth. And if any of it still held, someone would step out and key a handset to bring the fighters down. The farmhouse would not fall in a duel. It would sag like a tent whose poles had been kicked out in sequence. That was how the Americans fought a village. A crossroads, a woodline, a bridgehead, and whole sectors by turning terrain into coordinates. In the fog of war, such inevitability is rare. That it felt so common on the Western Front in 1945 explains why white flags sprouted like hedgerow blossoms in spring. Even the American infantryman's kit carried a promise of pressure. N-300 Seychelles rupees radio trudged, along with a rifle platoon, changing the geometry of fear. Before, a squad pinched by machine gun fire had to crawl out from under it or die under it. Now a few murmured words could bring down smoke, then high explosive, then a shift left or right to catch a reopened nest. Company and battalion mortar added their parabolic punctuation, and artillery headquarters pulled the whole grammar into a sentence whose period was a T and target. Mission that arrived like the sky folding. Allied air-ground procedure, hammered into habit by the 9th and 12th Army Groups and their tactical air commands, removed the old excuses. A German officer could claim that the enemy would need hours to align air support. A forward air controller with a jeep-mounted VHF set would answer that it could be minutes. Men in grey crowded under trees at noon, and listened to distant engines and could not tell whether those were for them. Indecision on that scale is corrosive. When the jobbos did arrive, they came low enough for pilots to read a man's panic. Rockets plucked at gun pits, .50 caliber fire-stitched ditches, and bombs turned parked trucks into cauldrons. No strict tally of dead and wrecked can capture what that did to will. War is a human calculation. How much good will my courage do? By the end of 1944, the Americans had found a way to answer. Less good than your radio will do you, and our radio is louder. The Eastern Shadow lay over all of this. The Red Army's offensive across the Vistula and the Oder in January and February cracked the German rear imagination along with its front. Letters home told of villages burned, of retreating columns hammered by Katyusha rockets, of Soviet artillery that matched American weight and was less discriminating. Wehrmacht men understood that there were two kinds of captivity ahead: and the choice of captor loomed over unit councils and sergeants' huddles. The American promise of Geneva treatment did not merely contrast with Soviet reputation. It harmonized with lived experience. From Normandy onward, leaflets signed by Eisenhower described safe conduct for prisoners. Men who had laid down arms wrote home that they were fed, sorted, deloused, and allowed to live inside an orderly machine whose purpose, however impersonal, did not include vengeance. Rumors grew in the telling, of course. Men are kind to their own fears, but the practical memory was accurate enough. If you walked west with your hands at shoulder height, a man with a clipboard would soon ask your name. By spring 1945, the American ability to receive prisoners had itself become an instrument of war. Temporary cages appeared like mirages behind the lines fields wired off. Rows of latrine pits dug, water trucks cycling in. A medical tent fluttering, and the sight of that infrastructure telegraphed a message. We can accept your surrender today. By contrast, in any sector where German administrative collapse was visibly fissures with maps but no telephones. Horses balking at ammunition limbers. Petrol siphoned into headquarters cars. The prospect of continued resistance looked shabby and personal. A matter of one unit's pride rather than a nation's plan. There were places where German formations fought to the last magazine, of course inside stubborn fortress towns, on bridges that covered withdrawals. In woods where local commanders still believed in the old slashing counterattack. Yet even these pockets of ferocity existed inside a larger American framework that made each last stand feel like a preface to the same ending. Defenders of Aachen watched the creeping barrage comb the streets until facades listed and cellars filled with powdered mortars. When that city fell, in October 1944, it taught every garrison west of the Rhine that urban stone no longer guaranteed status. The Hurtgen, where American units bled foreground, that a map would call trivial, taught the Americans, not the Germans, what not to do. By spring, those lessons had been metabolized into a doctrine that turned forests into finite problems. Fire lanes cut by engineers, pre-registered targets, slow pressure with artillery that cracked the tops off trees and rained shards as lethal as iron. When the bulge opened, the Americans rediscovered their strategic hardiness. Logistics rerouted in days. Divisions wheeled and marched like railroad timetables. But the German infantrymen discovered something else. That the American artillery arm, once allowed to use proximity fuses, could throw a roof of airbursts over an open field and turn it into a skillet. Survivors brought that news home, and news has gravity. It pressed on decisions in April. Imagine a German regimental staff near Iserlohn on April 14th. The map is a maze of red pencil. The phone line to a neighboring battalion is dead, and a liaison officer from Corps has just returned to say that fuel allocations have been cut again. The radio mutters about an American column sighted near a road junction. There is talk of a night attack to retake a ridge. Then someone notices that the cache of mortar rounds is down to a few crates. The MG belts have been split and resplit. The horses stabled behind the schoolhouse are gaunt, and the medical officer has run through his last morphine ampules. In the distance, a shell walks across a slope with the fussy regularity of a metronome. A Captain 1 with a wife and a photograph of a son in a sailor suit looks at his colonel and says the only thing that can't be recorded in war diaries. If we wait until they set the table, we will be the meal. The colonel nods. Hours later, a white cloth rides a stick, and an American lieutenant wades forward with a cigarette and a notepad. Multiply that by 1,000 conversations, and you have the West's End. American small unit culture mattered too, in ways that the word firepower can eclipse. By 1945, the U.S. Army had perfected a habit of delegation where it counted. Forward observers trusted to spend ammunition like water if it preserved rifle strength. Company commanders accustomed to asking for a box of tools. Smoke, heat tanks, engineers, air rather than choosing one. Battalion staffs willing to flatten an urban block instead of test a door with a squad. This was not recklessness. It was a financial logic applied to lives, and it advertised itself to an enemy who watched their own officers hoard shells for a counterstroke that never came. To a German NCO who had survived 1941 and 1942. This felt new. Americans were using resources not as ornaments for briefs, but as answers to problems in real time. So when a skirmish line buckled, an American platoon sergeant did not say, "Hold," at all costs. He said, "Get on the horn," and within minutes, the situation changed audibly. That sound, the first ranging crack, the correction. The ladder of detonations walking forward became the music to which surrender marched. There is a hard question beneath all this. Were the Americans simply the beneficiary of material superiority? Or was there a specific method that transformed those materials into a machine that bent will? The answer that sits inside the raw statistics is the latter. Ammunition without doctrine is a warehouse. Radios without trust are dead weight. Aircraft without integration are a nuisance. The Americans wrote a language of violence that used all three. A rifle platoon could climb that syntax in minutes. A corps could climb it in hours. And an army group could apply it across a front by day's end. The Germans recognized the grammar and chose to step out of the sentence. Statements from prisoners, formal and informal, say as much. The Trommelfeuer arrived too quickly. The jabots were everywhere. The Americans never ran out. Our guns were found and silenced. Our officers were brave, but could not conjure shells. The East was worse. The West would let us live. Some commanders even used the act of surrender to protect civilians, wagering that turning in their garrisons would save a town from a final, flattening fire plan. This is not romance. It is bureaucracy with a conscience. Fill out the terms. Stack the rifles. Feed the enemy's machine with warm bodies rather than corpses. By mid-April, American prisoner enclosures filled so fast that clerks struggled to keep rosters. Men slept under the open sky, in fields rimmed with wire, sitting in astonishingly neat rows because American MPs demanded it, and because order felt like proof that life would continue if rules were obeyed. Water trucks arrived, stoves smoked, chaplains circulated, cigarettes in hand. In those fields, soldiers compared notes about the last days, the VT bursts that chased them from hedgerows, the tanks that never seemed to halt, the way a bridge reappeared where a bridge had died, the steady thrum of logistics like a heart that would not tire. They were not naive about captivity. They were relieved to be inside an institution that they had chosen. As the Ruhr unraveled, figures blurred company, battalion, regiment into a kind of mass arithmetic. The Americans plucked pieces free for counterinsurgency duties, swept roads, parked tanks as roadblocks, and moved on in columns that threw dust like linen. The cities themselves, Dortmund, Essen, again yielded after the usual preliminaries. Maps marked with grids, artillery pre-registration, an invitation to surrender. Then the methodical reduction of resistance. In some places, the fighting was sharp and poignant. In others, it was a quiet negotiation by men who read the hour. Against this background, the suicide of Model on April 21st was a lonely gesture that underlined the end rather than defied it. His army had not broken because it lacked courage. It had dissolved because the choice between annihilation and preservation had been made obvious by an opponent who could conjure annihilation with such consistency that it felt like weather. That clarity carried across the rest of Western Germany. North of the Ruhr, British and Canadian forces performed their own hard mathematics. South of it, Americans crossed the Main and the Danube with procedural grace. And the surrender tides ran faster because every new river crossed told the same story. You will not stop this machine. In the last week of April, when American patrols reached the Isar and the Inn, men who had marched from Russia looked back over the year and forward over days and made the same calculation. And many chose the Americans before the Soviets chose them. Numbers will always be contested. Who counted whom? When a man with a bandage ceased to be a combatant. Whether a column halted because it had run out of will or water, but the large truth is stable. More than 500,000 German soldiers on the Western Front selected surrender to American forces rather than test their chances under American guns. The thesis is not that they feared only the shell and the rocket. It is that they feared their certainty. Certainty that the first ranging rounds would find them. Certainty that the air would be denied to them by day. Certainty that a bridge blown at dawn would be rebuilt by noon. Certainty that their batteries, once they flashed, would be hunted. Certainty that even if they survived 1 hour, the Americans could repeat the hour until there were no more of them left. Surrender, in that light, was not an absence of bravery, but a grim recognition that bravery had been discounted to near zero in the American economy of war. The men who walked out with hands high did not abase themselves. They stepped away from a system designed to erase them. And if you stood on a roadside in the Ruhr on April 18th and watched them pass, you would have seen something that looked less like defeat than relief. Helmets swinging from fingers, mouths dry and open, eyes sliding to the sky, and then back to the boots ahead of them. The line moving toward a wire pen, toward a clerk with a pencil, toward water, toward bread, toward a tomorrow that the Americans did not promise but made plausible by the very abundance of their fire. That is the end of our question and its answer, expressed not in doctrine but in motion. Men choosing a road edged by dust and sunlight over a trench rimmed by steel. Because in 1945, American firepower and the method that wielded it had made every other road lead to an end without witnesses. As we approach the end of our remembrance today, we're grateful you listened to this full story with us, and we're glad our archive has nourished your heart and soul. War stories have probably also marked your family's life in some way, haven't they? Maybe you wore the uniform yourself, or perhaps someone you loved did. Your father, a grandfather, or even an uncle. If so, we'd like to invite you to add another chapter to this record. Share with our community a war story that resonates in your family in the comments below. It could be a family tale, a saved letter, a lesson learned on a flight line, or in a muddy field. Anything you want. Tell us from where and what time are you listening to this message. This contribution helps to grow and keep our community together. We can't let these incredible stories be lost in time. The World War II Archives channel was created to honor and preserve these memories. Finally, if this resonates with you, we invite you to subscribe and perhaps share it with a friend who also recognizes the importance of these tales. Stay tuned so you don't miss the next one of our lost archives yet to come.